May 23, 1940. Squadron leader Roger Bushell led 12 Spitfires of his squadron over the coast between Dunkirk and Boulogne. Below, men were digging into the beaches and spilling blood on the sand. 40 German Messerschmitt 110s slid down toward the Spitfires, and 5 of them picked on Bushell. He steep-turned and fired, watching one enemy pour smoke and go straight down. Another came at him head-on, both firing, and then Bushell shot inches above the German. Smoke poured into his own cockpit. His engine seized gliding down, he belly-landed the Spitfire in a field, flames spurting under the cowlings. He scrambled out with blood running down his face and watched the plane burn. A German motorcyclist appeared at the far end of the field. Bushell saw the coal scuttle helmet and the gun pointing at him, and in that moment he became a prisoner of war. At Stalag Luft, the reception camp, the Germans put Bushell in solitary confinement to soften him for interrogation. He was a barrister by training, with a talent for what his fellow prisoners called suave belligerence, and they got nothing from him. They turned him loose in the compound, where he found a band of restless men trained to fight but locked behind barbed wire while their country faced invasion. Bushell soon joined the escape committee, and they dug tunnels with their hands, hauling dirt back in basins. He got out once through a tunnel at Barth and reached the Swiss border, only to be stopped by a guard 30 yards from freedom. He escaped again from a moving train, reached Prague, and was sheltered by Czech patriots. The Gestapo broke the escape chain, arrested him, and threw him into their cells in Berlin for months of interrogation. In late 1942, the Gestapo released Bushell back to Stalag Luft III, a new camp built in the sandy pine forests of Silesia. He was a changed man, moodier, the pale blue eyes colder, a grim focus hardening in his face. He found the other restless spirits waiting: Wally Floody, Tim Wallen, Peter Fanshawe. Bushell took over as Big X, the chief of the escape organization, and laid out a plan that seemed impossible. 3 tunnels, 30 feet deep, dug simultaneously with underground railways and workshops, forgery factories, and 100 men working in secret. The question was simple: could a handful of starving prisoners outthink the entire Third Reich? April 1st, 1943. 700 prisoners straggled across the sandy clearing into the new North Compound at Stalag Luft III, carrying their meager possessions. The camp was a raw patch of stump-studded dirt surrounded by double barbed wire fences, with pine woods pressing in on every side. Roger Bushell walked through the gate with the rest, his eyes already measuring distances to the tree line. Within hours, his tunnel chiefs were surveying the huts, picking the spots where the traps would go. Minskiewicz, a Polish officer with a small gray goatee, became the trap expert. He chipped a concrete slab out of the floor in Block 123, cast a perfect copy in a wooden mold, and fitted it back so precisely that even Bushell had to kneel and stare to spot the seam. In the washroom of Block 122, he cut a false wall into the drainage well, sealed it with soap and sand, and filled the well with water. Under the stove in room 23 of Block 104, Crump Kerr Ramsey hinged the tiled base so the whole stove could swing aside. 3 tunnels. Tom, Dick, and Harry now had hidden doors. Peter Fanshawe, a lean Royal Navy officer, solved the problem that had broken every previous tunnel: how to hide the sand. He cut the legs off a pair of long woolen underpants, tied string to each leg, and hung them inside his trouser legs with pins holding the bottoms closed. Fill the bags, stroll into the compound, pull the string. The pin came out and yellow sand trickled down to be scuffed into the dust. Fanshawe called them trouser bags. Within a week, 150 prisoners were wearing them, walking circuits around the compound while sand leaked from their cuffs. Down in the shaft of Tom, the digging shifts worked by the glow of fat lamps made from margarine tins. The sand was loose and crumbly, collapsing without warning. A box frame in the tunnel mouth shifted under pressure, and 100 pounds of sand cascaded down, nearly burying the digger at the face. Floody crawled forward, helped clear the fall, and the team reinforced the frame with double-strength boards. Work continued at the rate of about 6 feet a day. In June, Bushell launched a different kind of escape. 29 men marched out of the front gate in 2 parties, escorted by prisoners dressed as German guards. The first party of 24 men walked past the sentries without a hitch and vanished into the woods. The second party of 5 senior officers was stopped at the gate when a guard noticed the wrong stamp on a forged pass. Within 3 days, all 29 were back behind barbed wire or in the cooler. The escape had failed, but it proved the organization could move men through the gate. More importantly, it drew German attention away from the tunnels. That same month, Oberfeldwebel Glemnitz, the chief German security officer, found traces of yellow sand in the compound gardens. He said nothing at first, but the searches intensified. Ferrets crawled under huts with torches and probes. The Germans brought in heavy wagons and drove them around the compound, trying to collapse any shallow tunnels by weight. George Harsh, a gray-haired American major with a fanatical devotion to security, tightened the stooge system, posting watchers at every approach. The work slowed but did not stop. By July, the first huts of a new compound were rising outside the south fence. It was built for the American prisoners who were to be segregated from the British under a German high command order. Bushell realized the Americans would be moved before Tom was ready, so he concentrated all effort on that single tunnel, pushing the diggers to their limit. Glemnitz, still suspicious, ordered a trench dug between Block 123 and the wire. The Germans probed with steel rods, but Tom lay 30 feet deep, far beyond their reach. When the Americans marched out to their new compound a week later, they left behind a tunnel that had already passed under the wire. The ferret Herman had never stopped searching. The morning after the American compound was sealed, he took a steel probe into Block 123 and jabbed at the concrete floor near the chimney. The tip sank into a soft crack. He scraped away the cement dust and found the hairline edge of the hidden slab. Herman signaled, and within minutes the guards were there. The game was up for Tom. Bushell stood on the circuit and watched them smash the trap open. He made no move, no sign. The German engineers planted dynamite at the far end of the tunnel and blew it up, collapsing the entire length with a single roar. That was the end of the first tunnel. The loss did not stop the organization. Bushell had always planned for one tunnel to be found, and Dick and Harry were still sealed and hidden. That night he called a meeting of the department heads and told them to press forward with everything else. Tim Wallen's forgery factory expanded to full production. His artists worked in the library room in Block 110, hand-lettering identity cards and travel permits that matched the German originals in every detail. Al Haig set up a compass assembly line in Block 103, turning out small discs marked Made in Stalag Luft 3. The tailors cut old uniforms into civilian suits and boiled them in dye to change the color. Not every attempt waited for the tunnel. Through the autumn, men tried cutting their way through the wire on moonless nights. They crept out of the huts, crawled across the open ground, and snipped at the barbed strands, but the goonbox sentries caught them in searchlight beams almost every time. A dozen of them went to the cooler, and the Hunführer kept his dog on a short leash. Winter came early to Silesia. Snow covered the compound and the temperature dropped below freezing. Bushell could not risk opening Harry because the yellow sand would stain the white surface. He ordered a halt to all underground work and told the diggers to wait. On January 10, 1944, Bushell gave the signal, crump. Kerr Ramsey went to Block 104, Room 23, and knelt by the stove. The cement seal had hardened over the months, and he spent 2 hours chipping it away. When the last fragment fell, he lifted the stove aside and swung the tiled trapdoor up on its hinges. Below, the shaft was dry. The boards were still in place, the pump worked, and the tunnel stretched north into the darkness. Within the hour, the first diggers had stripped to their underclothes and crawled into Harry, scraping at the face with trowels. The race against the thaw had begun. On the afternoon of March 14, 1944, Crump Kerr Ramsey reached the end of the Harry tunnel. He had been digging upward for 2 weeks, fitting box frames and a ladder as he went, the sand clumping down around him in the damp cold. Johnny Bull, a veteran tunneler, had worked on all 3 tunnels since the first shafts were sunk. He went up the shaft to test the depth with a metal rod. 6 inches up, the rod met no resistance. The surface was that close. Bull enlarged the hole cautiously and stuck his head out into the open air, and what he saw hit him like a physical blow. The surveyors had misjudged the distance by 10 feet. Instead of forest cover, the exit lay in bare ground with the nearest goon box only 15 yards away, its searchlight beam still swinging over the compound fence. Bushell carved the instructions into the tunnel wall with a pencil. Then Bull crawled back up to tie the rope and wait for darkness. For the next 9 days, the camp moved under a blanket of controlled urgency. Bushell and Wingsday selected 220 names from the 600 men who had worked on the escape machines. The diggers, the forgers, the tailors, the map tracers, the sand penguins, the men who dispersed the excavated soil through concealed trouser bags. The first 70 went to the men who had contributed the most. The rest were drawn by lot, 20 more added by Bushell's own hand. Marshals held mock interrogations in every room, testing each man's cover story until he could repeat it in his sleep. Electric lights now ran the full length of the tunnel. The cable had been stolen and tapped from the camp mains. They stayed on day and night, casting a steady glow over the final convergence of every plan made in the past year. In the forgery room, Tim Wallin and his artists stamped the last identity cards, rail permits, and work passes. Each paper carried a date that could not be changed, March 24th, the only window before the moon returned. Al Hakey's compasses, Des Plunkett's strip maps, and Tommy Guest's converted suits were distributed and hidden in blanket rolls. Every man who would crawl through Harry that night carried a forged name, a false hometown, and a story that had to hold against a Gestapo check. By the evening of March 23rd, everything was in place. The tunnel lit, the documents signed, the wire cutters filed sharp, the rope tied to the ladder rung. All that remained was the signal. The evening of March 24th, 1944 was cold and moonless over Silesia. Inside Block 104, the last of the 220 waiting men sat in silence, their forged papers sewn into their coats, their compasses hidden in their boots. At 9:30, Roger Bushell gave the signal, and Johnny Bull climbed down the shaft one final time to open the exit. The rope procedure was in place. 2 tugs meant all clear, 1 tug meant freeze. Bull broke through the last crust of soil and found himself in open ground 15 yards from a guard tower. The escape was alive. Down the tunnel, the trolleys ran on bedboard rails, carrying men on their bellies through the narrow blackness. But the system was slower than anyone had planned. Suitcases jammed against the shoring frames, and the trolley wheels kept jumping the tracks. Each derailment meant a crawling delay while a hauler wriggled forward in the dark, reset the wheels, and signaled the all clear. Then just after midnight, the sirens wailed over Berlin, and every light in the compound went dead. In the sudden blackout, the tunnel became a trap of suffocating darkness. Men lay pinned in the halfway houses, unable to move, their lungs working in the thick air. Wings Day took a fat lamp and crawled the full length of the tunnel, leaving a light in each staging post. His steady nerves held the line together. When the all clear sounded 40 minutes later, the shuttle restarted, but the lost time was never recovered. By dawn, only 76 of the planned 220 had cleared the hole. At 5 minutes to 5, the Eastern sentry broke his pattern. Instead of walking his usual beat along the road, he cut across the edge of the woods, straight toward the exit hole. Revell Carter, one of the escapees who had just cleared the tunnel, crouched behind a brushwood screen, saw him coming and stood up, shouting in German. The sentry fired a wild shot, and the silence of the forest shattered. In the tunnel, men froze. The game was up. Back in Block 104, Crump Kerr-Ramsey heard the shot and knew immediately what it meant. He slammed the trap closed and moved the stove back over it while the last men still underground scrambled back down the tunnel. In the corridor, prisoners tore their forged papers into strips and fed them into the fire. The smoke was thick and acrid. By the time the guards burst through the door, the evidence was ash, and 140 men sat waiting in the gray light. Von Lindiner arrived with drawn pistol, his face crimson with rage. The ferrets tore open every cupboard and paillasse. Rubberneck stood at the door with a revolver, his knuckles white on the trigger. They lined the prisoners up in the snow and stripped them naked, searching each garment. When the count came back, 76 men were missing. Outside the wire, the exit hole lay open, and the last footprints of the escapees led into the dark trees. The net closed fast. Within 48 hours, the Gestapo had thrown a cordon across Germany, checking every train, every road, every village. The escapees were picked off one by one at railway stations, on country lanes in barns where they had stopped to rest. A few made it as far as Stettin, Danzig, or the Swiss border. Most were caught within the first week. Only 3 would never be found. Hitler was at Berchtesgaden when he received the report. He flew into a screaming rage and ordered that more than half the recaptured men be shot. Himmler and Keitel drafted the order that same day. The Gestapo called it the Sagan Order. When the escapees were pulled from their cells and told they were being returned to the camp, they were taken instead to roadside ditches and shot in the back of the head. The reports were faked, shot while trying to escape. On April 6th, the commandant called the senior British officer to his office. His face was gray. He read the list of names in a flat voice, 41 dead. Massey sat in silence, then asked how many were wounded. Commandant looked at the carpet and said he thought none. The total would later rise to 50. That afternoon, a typed sheet was pinned to the camp notice board. Men stood around it in silence, reading the names of their friends. The horror was total. The camp spent the winter under the shadow of that list. In January 1945, with the Red Army crashing through Silesia, the Germans forced the prisoners onto the road. 600 emaciated men marched through waist-deep snow, without food, without blankets. Those who collapsed were shot in the ditch. For 10 days they walked, and then they were packed into open cattle trucks and shipped west toward the approaching American lines. The guards grew more nervous with each mile. They had orders to execute all prisoners if the column failed to reach the Elbe by a certain date. But the date passed, and the guards, knowing the war was lost, quietly let the order slide. On May 2nd, 1945, the column was sheltering in barns near Lübeck when the sound of tank engines rolled through the trees. The hatches opened and 2 British soldiers stuck their heads out. For men who had been behind wire for 3, 4, even 5 years, the sight of a British uniform was unreal. They ran toward the tanks shouting. Some wept, some just stood there unable to speak. The war in Europe ended 7 days later. Of the 76 who had crawled through the hairy tunnel, 50 were dead. One of them, Roger Bushell, had been shot near Saarbrücken on March 28th, 4 days after the breakout, 5 weeks before the surrender. Tim Wallin was also among the executed. Johnny Bull, who had opened the exit shaft, was not recaptured and survived the war. Wally Floody, George Harsh, and Peter Fanshawe had been transferred out of the compound before the escape and survived the war. Crump Kerr-Ramsay, the chief tunnel engineer, was barred from the escape to retain experienced tunnelers and survived the war in the camp. The British did not forget. In August 1945, a Scotland Yard detective named Wing Commander Bowes flew to Germany with a small team and a single brief, find the men who had murdered the 50. He had almost nothing to start with, a few names, a collection of urns, and the testimony of the survivors. Over the next 3 years, he and his interrogators questioned 250,000 Germans. Bit by bit, the killers emerged from the shadows. They tracked the Gestapo men one by one. Zacharias was found in Bremen, escaped from custody, recaptured. Burchard was living under a false name in a carpenter's shop near the Swiss border. Post was pulled from a garage in Celle. Sharpwinkle died in a Moscow prison. 18 men were brought to trial in Hamburg in a gray courtroom overlooking the city. The evidence took 50 days to present, 1 day for each murdered man. The verdicts came down in September 1947. 15 men were sentenced to death. 1 sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. On February 26, 1948, 14 of them were hanged in Hamelin prison. The others received life sentences. Not all the killers faced the noose. Some died in the rubble of Berlin, some vanished into the post-war chaos. But the main architects of the Sagan Order were accounted for. Justice, however slow, had come. The escape itself has become legend, but the legend should not obscure the cost. 50 men were murdered not because they were spies, not because they had done anything wrong under the laws of war, but because the regime that held them could not tolerate the fact that they had not surrendered their will. They dug a tunnel 348 feet long through loose sand, under the noses of armed guards with their bare hands and their ingenuity. And when they were caught, they did not beg. If you have any stories from your own family, fathers, uncles, neighbors who served in the air war over Europe or who spent time behind the wire, we would be honored if you would share them in the comments below. We read each one, and if you believe that stories like this deserve to be remembered, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us keep telling the stories that history should not forget. Thank you for listening.